Alright, so in this video I want to talk about some new research that has come out concerning the anti-white racial bias you see among self-identified liberals and leftists, and to put that research within the context of the broader field of research on this phenomenon, and to show that at this point this is a pretty well-replicated finding of social science. And as always, the sources for the stuff I'm going to be talking about can be found in the description. So the new paper is called "When is Discrimination Unfair?" And in this paper, participants had two different scenarios described to them. One was supposed to feature a less justifiable case of discrimination in the process of hiring someone, and then the second was supposed to demonstrate a more justifiable instance of discrimination. Here's an example of the less justifiable case of discrimination. There, a Michael who is white is about to hire his first customer representative for his business after a few years of carrying out that role alongside his managerial duties. He has interacted with a number of black people during his education and work experience. While all of his interactions with black people have been polite and professional, he just didn't enjoy interacting with them. For his new hire, Michael has to choose between two applicants whose resumes, interviews, and references are all of equal quality, one of whom is black and one who is white. Michael decides to hire the white worker in order to avoid interacting with a black employee. And then in the more justifiable context, it goes like this. He has conducted focus groups with a substantial share of the people who frequent his business. Many of the customers tell Michael that they do not like interacting with black people and would be hesitant about continuing to support his business if he employed them. Michael himself is just as happy to interact with black workers as with workers of other races. Michael decides to hire the white worker in order to avoid losing sales to customers who do not want to interact with black representatives. After each scenario, participants were asked to indicate the extent to which you thought Michael's hiring decision was fair, and participants would hear a description of that scenario one way and then have the races reversed the second time. And what was found, as you can see, is that both in the less justifiable and more justifiable context, discrimination against black people was rated as significantly less fair than was the same discrimination against white people. Moreover, when you break this down by self-identified political orientation, you find that this is entirely driven by moderates and liberals, that for them, discrimination is significantly more unfair when that discrimination has a black target rather than a white target, whereas for conservatives, there is not a significant difference between the two. That finding is going to be repeated. And I should also note that these are self-identified liberals. I say that because whenever I talk about this research, some people get in my comments screeching about how these aren't liberals, they're leftists, and this sort of thing. And if you want to use a word the way that it was used hundreds of years ago that almost no one uses it today, that's fine, you can do that. But I'm just reporting the data as it actually is. I'm not going to pretend that they found data on self-identified groups that they didn't in order to match sort of weird linguistic habits that certain people have. Now, the next study I want to talk about is from 2000, and I'm pointing that out because some people think that the anti-white bias of liberals is a very new thing, as in something that happened, say, within the last 7 or 8 years, and this is very much not the case. So in this study, people had a situation described to them, and I've copy and pasted it here because in the original PDF it's split pages, and so it wouldn't make a very good screenshot. But they tell people that Dave Johnson is an insurance executive who must make a decision about whether his company will start writing home insurance policies in 6 different towns in his state. He classifies 3 of the towns as high risk. 10% of the houses suffer damage from fire or break-ins each year. And it turns out that 85% of the population of these towns is black, is what some people heard. No reference to race is what some people heard. He classifies the other 3 towns as relatively low risk. Less than 1% of the houses there suffer fire or break-ins and damage each year. And it turns out 85% of this population is white, or no reference to race. Participants then rated on a 9-point scale support for changing the price of the insurance depending on the area and, in fact, the decision of whether or not to sell the insurance at all. And so when asking people how much they supported a policy where the insurance was sold at the same price in all these towns, even though they radically differed by risk, it was found that liberals did support such a policy, and so disfavored discriminating based on risk when the high-risk area was populated by black people, but they did not oppose such a policy when the race of the people living in the high-risk area was not mentioned. Now, the default assumption in America for any neighborhood is going to be that it is white, and moreover, the only way to explain why it is that they would oppose that once they found out that people living there were black is that they were assuming that people were not black, and therefore the only reasonable way to interpret that is that they were assuming that they were white, either implicitly or explicitly in their minds. The same difference was found when asking whether or not insurance should be sold to all places, as opposed to just not selling it all to the high-risk areas. Now, at this time, in contrast to what we just saw in the previous study, moderates were not exhibiting a significant racial bias here, and as we're going to see in virtually all these studies, neither were conservatives. The authors of this paper write, liberals exposed to the black-tainted as opposed to white-tainted base rates were more likely to agree that the executive should sell insurance for the same price across zones. In addition, liberals exposed to the black-tainted base rate were less likely to agree that the executive should charge higher premiums in the high-risk zones. To test the blatant racism hypothesis, the same contrasts were performed but revealed no effect on any dependent measure, and as you can see in the parentheses, they're talking about that conservatives would support more egalitarian pricing when the high-risk zones turn out to be populated by whites. Now, a more recent paper worth mentioning is this paper, A Cross-Cultural Analysis of Censorship on Campuses. The first study involved 595 U.S. adults, and they told these people that scholars have suggested that black or white people, depending on the group, score higher than the other on intelligence tests. It is likely that at least some of this gap is caused by genetics, that is, whites or blacks are genetically smarter than the other. Following each passage, participants rated their agreement with 4 statements. They should remove the book from the library. A professor should not be allowed to require this book for class. Students should not be allowed to cite this book, and it would not be good if students read the book, which is supposed to be measures of censorship attitudes. And they rated their agreement with those on a 1 to 7 scale, with 1 being not at all, 7 being very much. And as we can see, support for censorship was significantly higher when it was black people who were being said to have the higher IQ than it was when white people were being the ones said to have a higher IQ. They replicated this in a sample of college students from the United States, the UK, and Hungary, and here we see this effect is even more extreme. Now, importantly, of course, as most people know, most journalists and most academics are liberal, and what this study tells us is that we have good reason to think that they would favor censoring information that explained racial inequality in terms of something like a higher IQ of white people if that information were valid. And it is therefore simply not rational. There's strong empirical evidence here showing it is not rational to expect them to tell you the truth about this. People of their ideology literally on surveys will tell you that they don't favor people knowing this information if it is true. So why would you expect them to just give it to you? So the next paper that we're going to look at comes from 2009, and this has to do with killing people. So as the study says, participants received one of 2 scenarios involving an individual who has to decide whether or not to throw a large man in the path of a trolley, described as large enough that he would stop the progress of the trolley in order to prevent the trolley from killing 100 innocent individuals trapped in a bus. Half of the participants received a version of the scenario where the agent could choose to sacrifice an individual named Tyrone Payton to save 100 members of the New York Philharmonic, and the other half received a version where the agent could choose to sacrifice Chip Ellsworth III to save 100 members of the Harlem Jazz Orchestra. And they go on to say that while we did not provide specific information about the race of individuals in the scenario, we reasoned that Chip and Tyrone were stereotypically associated with white Americans, black Americans, and that the New York Philharmonic would be assumed to be majority white, and the Harlem Jazz Orchestra would be assumed to be majority black. So what they found was that liberals were more likely to endorse a consequentialist justification, meaning that you sacrifice the one person to save the 100, when the victim had a stereotypically white name than when the victim had a stereotypically black name, whereas more conservative participants did not give reliably different endorsements of consequentialism across scenario versions. And they go on to perform another study just replicating this essentially, where they find that liberals were more likely to endorse a consequentialist justification when Chip was sacrificed than when Tyrone was, and more conservative participants did not reliably give different endorsements of consequentialism for Chip and Tyrone. They also say that participants in the community sample completed additional measures, and when asked to guess the race of the target character, 79% said that Chip was white, 64% said that Tyrone was black. So most people interpreted it in the way that they intended, but importantly, they say the key interaction reported above remains statistically significant even when including only those participants who passed the manipulation check. So when only looking at those people who correctly interpreted the information as it was intended, we still have the same effect. And they go on to say that we asked participants if they would give different judgments had the victim been of a different race, and the overwhelming majority, 92%, said they would not. This did not vary by political orientation. And what I think is happening here is basically that at this time, because as we saw from the 2000 paper and now this is a period in which liberals did have an anti-white bias, but they weren't honest. They definitely weren't honest with others about this, and I think that has changed. And they also weren't honest, I think, probably even with themselves about this. So that the difference between then and now isn't the existence of the bias, it's the honesty about the bias. Now that being said, there is an obvious imperfection in this study in that these names, Chip Ellsworth III and such, might be also picking up on people's class biases, not just race biases, and so that is a potential flaw in the research that should be recognized. Another piece of evidence I want to note is from Zach Golberg, who is a political scientist who I believe in the process of completing his dissertation looked at survey data, which just asked people how warmly they felt towards different groups. And what it was discovered was that in the case of non-white people, they all felt a bit more warmly towards their own group than they did towards other groups. And that was also true of non-liberal white people. But white liberals stood out as kind of weirdos here because they, on net, indicated to this survey that they felt less warmly about their own group than they did other groups. Now, of course, this further evidences the anti-white bias of liberals, but I think it also is worth noting that what this indicates, if we sort of combine this with the data we've already seen, is that non-liberal white people may in fact have a kind of internal racial bias in favor of their own ethnic group, but they've also internalized norms, a set of norms against acting out on the basis of those biases. Now, the final paper I want to look at helps us answer the question, does liberal ideology just correlate with an anti-white bias, or does something about liberal ideas cause an anti-white bias? And so in this paper, they sat participants down and they had them read this thing that said, in America, there is a long history of white people having more power than other racial groups. Although many people think of racial inequality as decreasing, there are still privileges that are experienced by white Americans that are not true for other racial groups. For example, in her essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, Peggy McIntosh, PhD, lists different privileges that she experiences as a white person living in America. They then read 4 privileges taken from McIntosh's work. These were, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely and positively represented. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group, and I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me. Participants were then asked to list 2 privileges that white people experience in America. After this exercise, participants were directed to what was described as the second study. Now, in this, they heard about a guy named Kevin, who they heard was either a white or black American living in New York, whose life had been defined by poverty. As a child, Kevin was raised by a single mom who struggled to balance several part-time jobs simply to pay the bills. Most winters, they had no heat, and it was a daily question whether they would have enough to eat. In late 2016, Kevin began to receive welfare assistance. Since then, he has not applied for any jobs and instead has cycled between jail cells, shelters, emergency rooms, and the streets. Although Kevin would like to be financially independent, he doesn't feel he has the skills or ability to obtain a well-paying job. And then people were asked to rate how sympathetic they felt towards Kevin's situation. Now, firstly, as you can see, in the first study, social conservatives did not differentiate in terms of the level of sympathy depending on if the person was black or white, but in the case of social liberals, they felt more sympathetic when the person was black, replicating this kind of anti-white bias. But the study noted they didn't have a control group, so they can't say for sure that that little white privilege intervention caused liberals to feel this way. So they did another study with a control group, and in the control condition, liberals rated their sympathy as similarly in the 2 groups, but after hearing about the white privilege lesson, sympathy for poor white people went way down. Among social conservatives, funnily, in this second study, there was a difference favoring black people in the control condition, but in the white privilege condition, sympathy for white people went up so that it was as high as their sympathy for black people. Anyway, to sum up, liberals do have an anti-white bias, which is reflected in their views surrounding hiring discrimination, insurance policies, censorship, self-rated warmth towards other groups, and who they think can be justifiably murdered. Conservatives may have an internal bias that is pro-white, but they have been uniquely socialized seemingly to not act out on this bias or form other views on the basis of this bias in any measurable way. Liberal ideas are not merely associated with anti-white bias, they cause anti-white bias, and our key knowledge institutions, academia and the media, are run by people who mostly adhere to this anti-white ideology. So that's the video. Leave a like if you enjoyed it. Consider subscribing if you like the channel, or even materially supporting the channel. And in any case, thanks for watching.